And good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to join this very important discussion and share my research. Today, I will be presenting information from a dissertation study on decision-making among Black caregivers. I have no disclosures or conflicts to declare. Before we get started, I wanted to share some information about my background so that you know what informs my work. I grew up in the 53216 zip code area in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. For me, this zip code is what I considered home. It was my village. I lived in the Sherman Park neighborhood, but it was also an area that experienced very similar outcomes to what we saw happening across the country. There was increasing gentrification, and while the community certainly had a number of strengths, there were a number of social and economic issues that I grew up in, lived my life in the numbers, right? And so all too often we think about data points, but I'm that data point. I attended public school and was a part of what they called ability-based grouping. You probably have heard of performance academically talented, gifted and talented. That was an interesting experience for me. Very early on, I saw how teachers' expectations and classroom management approaches influence learners. It raised questions within me. How can someone be one way with one group and another way with a different group? And what was the impact of that on the learner? I also paid attention to different types of things growing up. I can remember my mom, we'd pack in the car, and at that time it was probably a Bonneville. So go on these car rides with my mom, and we'd be just sort of like driving along. We talk about things like, do you see how the grass is different here? Do you see how the homes look different the further away that we get away from our neighborhood? You notice that we don't see any in convenience stores? Over time, I learned that someone was somewhere in some office getting paid very well to predict my lifespan based on my zip code. My research and the reason why I'm sharing this matters. Who conducts research matters. Who leads practice implementation matters. So I went from a kid who grew up on 33rd and in the 53216 zip code, in a working poor family, to someone who became a community planner, a program officer at a foundation, an entrepreneur, and now a scientist. My program of research reflects these observations and my training as a social worker. Each person is uniquely tied to their environment. As we age, our social and health opportunities and outcomes are in part shaped by that environment. In this line of research, I have been particularly interested in life events that influence the individual and broader forces which you've heard about today, such as racism. I'm interested in those things that we would call wicked problems. They're so complex, we don't know where to start. They're so complex. Even if you make progress here, things get screwed up over here. These really, really complicated things. I'm interested in understanding how we unpack them and how we engineer supports to move ourselves to a different place. My second area of research focuses on understanding experiences, accessing and utilizing supports, and the design and the testing of those interventions, especially in environments and among populations that have some of the worst health and social outcomes. So I come to this work leading a very, very full, rich life with a number of perspectives, a number of identities that are important when we think about how do we as a country, how do we as a global group, a global community tackle health? How do we leverage all of these perspectives to move change forward and make things better for all of us? Now, let's take a look at our objectives for this session. I will share a model on decision-making, identify dominant factors that influence decision-making, describe the different types of decisions within that model, and identify some strategies caregivers can employ to navigate decision-making. Today, the other speakers have provided information on dementia, the burden of dementia, high levels of unmet need that we see among persons with dementia and their caregivers, and health disparities in dementia. So I'm not going to go through the data. We also know that aside from these numbers, that African Americans or Blacks, I'll use those words interchangeably, are underrepresented in dementia research. In light of these disparities and challenges, we really, truly need to understand their experiences in order to facilitate the development of strategies to address caregiving needs, especially in environments that may be considered disadvantaged. These underserved areas that we keep hearing about. These are the areas that experience the greatest challenge, or what some people call contextual disadvantage. Despite documented disparities, what is absent is a unique understanding of how African American dementia caregivers respond to challenges they face. This is a critical question that needs to be answered to better support caregivers and address their unmet needs, burden, and poor outcomes. My team at the university, this researcher was originally at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We originally planned to investigate crisis. This is prior to COVID. Then COVID took all my steam, right? But we set out to understand crisis. We wanted to really take a look at the crisis literature, because African American perspectives, even in terms of how we defined what a crisis is, we were absent from those studies. This voice was missing. So we, at that time, kind of understood crisis to be a social process. And as we were thinking about hearing from the community, we really wanted to select a method for this sort of investigation into crisis that would prioritize the voices and perspectives of people with lived experience. So we did not want to impose the term crisis on African American dementia caregivers. So our method allowed us to hear from people in their own words without imposing on them. Because of this, the original study changed. We did not examine crisis. We examined a social process called responding. I'm sorry for the background noise. We examined a social process called responding. Because of this, we decided to pursue a method called grounded dimensional analysis to conduct our study. So we know that having an understanding of how people on the ground experience things supports, it just does so much, right? And so we really sort of saw being able to take a look at how African American dementia caregivers respond to new emergent events, that this really was a foundational step toward developing solutions that were informed by their perspectives. Some of our rationale for selecting this particular method, we wanted to stay as close as possible to caregiver voice, to capture their perspectives and experience. We thought that this voice was so underrepresented, and at times when it is represented, people speak for that group. And we did not want to do that in our study. We wanted to uncover variation in caregiver experiences. We also wanted to identify and map out a process that could inform problem solving. So we wanted to use a method that actually said, we will act and do something about it. With grounded dimensional analysis, we really are using a method that facilitates the discovery of social processes that are often unknown, not well contextualized. Sometimes they're complex, or they're experienced differentially by populations within a society. The key question in a grounded dimensional analysis study is, what all is happening? As a way of understanding what all is happening, when caregivers respond to a situation, we examine dimensions within a social process. A dimension is a description of a concept that makes clear all the components of that concept. Dimensions help us identify what all is happening in a way that captures and incorporates granular data into a social process. Dimensions organize and label granular data. This is information we get directly from study participants to define what is happening in a social process. To illustrate a dimension, I dimensionalize relationship dynamics. The dimensions of relationship dynamics include a number of features. Dimensions support building the social process from the ground up. Our analytic procedures within this method really then help us move from a dimension to a conceptual model that holds this social process. The next few slides are going to talk a little bit more about grounded dimensional analysis, and then I'll jump into the study. The components of a social process are listed here. Context is a set of background circumstances that shape a social process. In our study, the caregiving context is shaped by the social determinants of health, which we heard about, which produce social disadvantages and health disparities. Conditions, these are the factors that influence actions. Conditions may be singular or multiple. This study focused on conditions specific to responding. Actions capture what was done or strategies that caregivers engage as a part of responding. And consequences. Consequences are the result of actions. In this study, we examined the outcomes of responding. The value of examining caregiver perspectives is that we can really make explicit the heterogeneity or all of the difference that we see in lived experience by uncovering what we call variation. So transition into our study. This is a study where we sought out to understand crisis and to understand responding. We wanted to reach caregivers, so we had a number of strategies in place. We wanted to reach from caregivers in those really tough areas, those areas that people describe as not having resources, those areas that people describe as being really sort of challenging to live in. So we use what we call our area deprivation index to determine where we would recruit. We worked with 2 offices, the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Institute and an organization called Black Leaders for Brain Health to recruit participants in our study. And we also engaged in what we call theoretical sampling. So we just did not want to hear from individuals as our only way of getting information. We wanted to learn a little bit about the types of experiences or the types of events or the types of decisions that caregivers were engaged with. We see our exclusion criteria listed on this slide, mainly adults who provide some level of regular care, regular unpaid care to a person experiencing changes or declines in cognitive function. We completed telephone interviews with 10 caregivers with an average interview time of 50 minutes. Interviews were recorded and transcribed. We did use a group of people to take a look at the data. And what we produced is a final conceptual model. And we developed that model and we checked back with caregivers. This is a technique called member checking, where data is shown to participants, caregivers, to determine if the information in the model resonates with their lived experience, and really utilizing the wisdom of caregivers to fill in any gaps. Again, we wanted to stay as close to participants' experiences as possible. So we wanted to make sure that our model would be what we call grounded. So we presented this model. We made changes based on additional feedback from our caregivers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but what I will say is that we wanted to make sure that we were thoughtful about how we built this model, that we honored people's lived experience. We honored the stories that we heard. And so we developed and really utilized a really rigorous, systematic, scientific process to look at data from caregivers. I'm not going to say too much more on this slide, other than our work in developing this conceptual model caused us to go back frequently to check with caregivers go back to look at notes that we recorded, to go back and really make sure that what we were developing reflected the viewpoints and perspectives of Black caregivers. So on to our study results. First, let's talk a little bit about the overall model of responding. In our study, we defined responding as a social process characterized by an event that facilitates caregiver action to bring about desired outcomes. Now, let's take a look at some individual components of this model. What we found happening is that first, caregivers evaluated an event or situation. When evaluating a situation, caregivers describe a range of activities to inform their understanding of a situation, such as making observations and gathering information. Caregivers thought through the situation to account for the complexities that were present and to move forward toward resolving the situation. In the next sequence of responding, caregivers move toward evaluation of available choices by really assessing the full range of possibilities to address a situation. As part of evaluating choices, caregivers perceive that different possibilities were available from which to select and act upon. We found that caregivers' evaluation of the situation often generated questions. They questioned whether or not an action was needed, by whom, the timing of that action, the consequence of that action, what actions were possible, what actions should be pursued. These considerations, we kind of call them going through the what ifs. This constituted what we called a decisional process. Decision-making is a type of response. We did not pursue all types of responses. What we did do, though, is we were hearing something really interesting in our data. Caregivers were really describing decision-making where there was limited choice. This presentation is going to focus a little bit more on limited choices that caregivers made. So the first dimension of limited choice, what we heard from caregivers is sometimes as they sort of make decisions, there's this dimension of doing and feeling like there were limited options. Caregivers characterize this experience as feeling forced or trapped when making a decision. Even if other options were available, caregivers did not perceive that these options were available to them. While limited options for making decisions really covered a range of situations, what we found is that situations involving health emergencies, institutionalization, preventing the care recipient from being taken advantage of, and self-care were frequently reported in the dimension of limited choice here. The next dimension of perceived limited choice decisions were decisions described as doing and feeling like I have to do. These decisions often involved strong motivating factors, with caregivers reporting the sense of being compelled to act in response to a situation because something had to be done. Caregivers reported greater awareness of active decision-making within this particular dimension. Our final dimension is doing without thinking. Caregivers describe this decision as rapid, generally in response to an abrupt situation. This dimension was also characterized as involving decisions that were integrated into everyday caregiving. These decisions were repeated so frequently that they became routine that our caregivers actually were not even able to conceptualize that they were making decisions. Caregivers describe these decisions as automatic. Finally, our conceptual model just looks at consequences. Our consequences are kind of in two broad categories. Feelings and psychological states that accompany decision-making is reflected in this model. And our model also identifies outcomes, such as health status, behaviors, change in care arrangements, and other issues that caregivers reported. I wanted to briefly walk through an example. In this example, which focuses on stepping up, the caregiver is a power of attorney and describes the process of a changing role when making a decision as dementia progresses. This caregiver called this process stepping up. In box 1, we note that the power of attorney recognized a decline in cognitive function. Box 2 notes that the power of attorney evaluated the situation by thinking about the safety of the care recipient, their own actions, not making a situation worse, and the relationship dynamics between the POA and the care recipient. Box 3 notes that the POA then evaluated available choices. Box 4 notes that the power of attorney determined that this was a situation in which they did not have a choice. Box 5 notes that the power of attorney made a limited choice decision by deciding to step up and to change their perspective. Box 6 notes that the outcome of this action was the power of attorney trusting their decision and assuming a more authoritative role. As we looked at our model, there were a number of things influencing the process of responding as caregivers were making limited choice decisions. I'll share those here. Dominant conditions were really described as central considerations caregivers gauge throughout the process of responding and reveal motivations that sometimes were unvoiced by caregivers, but did inform their responses. While dominant conditions were sometimes making a particular situation more complex, sometimes these dominant conditions really supported the caregiver in having a clear and simple way of responding. One example of that is the care recipient falls and complains of pain, and that really prompts the caregiver to seek emergency care. So let's start with availability of resources and supports. These were described as tools to assist with problem solving for our caregivers. In our study, caregivers appraised resources and supports very broadly. They talked about relationships, information and knowledge, caregiving work, time, and program and services, and also the extent of their availability, i.e. such as utilization of respite care, given monthly allocated time for this resource if there were limitations. Resources and supports were also appraised by caregivers for situational fit. For example, placement of a care recipient after a surgery in a home with stairs versus a home without stairs. Caregivers also thought about the extent to which a resource or support facilitated resolution of a situation. Secondly, caregivers really, it was just so clear in our data. Caregivers were really paying attention to, is the care recipient being taken advantage of? In several instances, our caregivers highlighted a zero tolerance standard for financial abuse and other things such as exposure to alcohol and drugs or other actions that place a care recipient in a situation that leave them vulnerable to persons with the capacity to knowingly or unknowingly cause harm. I have tons of stories that I can tell you. I've spent the last 5 years talking to all sorts of caregivers, and this really stands out. Expectations for meeting sort of the role of being a caregiver or helping out. This was our final dominant condition here, and this focus on caregivers really having some expectations about the role of a caregiver. Caregivers wanted to maintain face. They wanted to maintain this sense, not just sort of internally about how they're doing, how they're performing as a caregiver, but they also describe that people on the outside are looking in. Is mom okay? Is dad okay? And if mom and dad aren't okay, they saw this as a reflection on them. And that really did motivate our caregivers to get involved or not get involved with particular types of responses in this decisional process. So what I wanted to do here is just talk a little bit about some promising strategies that may help support decision-making. And one thing that I want to tell you is what we routinely heard from caregivers is we heard a lot of things, right? We heard about just after we got that diagnosis, getting that diagnosis was so helpful. And it facilitated things like getting services. Well, getting that diagnosis did not make the process of responding easier. And in fact, it got difficult for caregivers. They now were solving problems with physicians and care teams, solving problems, i.e. responding by making decisions with other family members, making decisions, trying to maintain the autonomy of the care recipient. So when I think about decision-making and these promising strategies, as we sort of think about the progression of dementia, we were hearing so much from caregivers as they appraised how decision-making changed, where they went from this, I really have to respect mom and dad, aunt, whoever I'm taking care of, to really, as one person put it, I have to kind of help my mom sort of believe that she's the one making decisions, and then sort of getting to the point where I make this decision. And so while this process of responding was described as a social process, there are a number of things that happened psychologically within caregivers in terms of how they saw their role. So much juicy stuff was a part of this study. But I'm going to get back to these promising strategies that we found that caregivers used to support responding by making a decision. One thing that was really clear is that care recipients who had set in place a power of attorney, care recipients who noticed that there were changes going on and wanted to get ahead of things, we noticed in our study among our sample that document and sort of the role that people assume when they were the power of attorney really made a huge difference in terms of folks being comfortable making a decision. It made an important difference in being able to represent the care recipient in health settings, or to really think about the dynamics of the family and how to navigate things. So that there's something really important about having an agreement and having it written down that really supported and helped our caregivers both sort of clarify and get really comfortable operating in this role with this decision sort of capacity that they have. Other strategies, and there were just so many. We saw some caregivers activating professionals. And so we saw this with some caregivers being really strategic. My brother, my sister, my mom or dad, siblings don't want to do this. So I'm going to use the doc. I'm going to use our primary care physician to get this message across. I'm going to work with the social worker. My family's not listening to me, but they'll listen to that professional. We also saw our caregivers activating their informal networks. These were neighbors, these were persons at the church, these were friends. We really saw our caregivers sort of creating a space, both for themselves and the care recipient, to be taken care of. And some of that in part had to do with watching the care recipient and monitoring the care recipient. And that was also maybe linked to one of our dominant conditions that I didn't talk about, which was really sort of vigilance, where caregivers were kind of just monitoring and really having sort of a careful look at all of the things that were going on in the situation. Caregivers reported using tools. This could be, Mom, I wrote it on the calendar so that the caregiver could see, when did they last speak to a grandchild? When did they last eat? When did they last do this? Caregivers also talked about the overwhelming responsibility of paying bills in another household and tracking all of the financial information, all of the paperwork, all of the mail that was coming in. And we saw caregivers talking about really the use of technology, i.e. automatic bill pay, i.e. previewing mail before it's actually delivered. So this idea of utilizing tools became really important as our caregivers made decisions. And finally, our caregivers just went out of their way to talk about the Alzheimer's Association and other groups in the community and resources that they had that were specific to dementia. They went out of their way to talk about, I thought I knew this. I thought I knew a little bit about dementia, or I didn't know about dementia, but I thought I could handle it. That these dementia-specific resources really supported them in just in tangible ways. And caregivers spoke so frequently about, I went back to my materials from that workshop. I went back to my handbook. I went back to this because what was happening with the person that they were caring for, that they felt like quite routinely that they needed some additional information, some additional perspective to figure out how to handle things. And it could be anything from managing conflict to figuring out, moms or dads, staying up at night. Mom and dad is wandering. But there was something important about dementia-specific supports being made available that supported decision-making. So in this study, what we have done is mapped out the process of responding, and we have characterized this process as an event that facilitates caregiver action to bring about desired outcomes. We reviewed our conceptual model, took a look at some contextual information, conditions, actions, and consequences related to responding. We talked a little bit about dominant conditions as a part of this discussion. But what I also think is important here that I want to get back to, so what and where do we go from here? So first, I think that dementia must be viewed as a condition that families face. The caregivers in our study reported that family structures, that they extend beyond spouse, sibling, and adult children involvement in caregiving. The broader caregiving network among the folks that we spoke with must be engaged so that the response to challenges they face can be addressed both effectively and in a timely manner. We observe that long-standing issues within families surface as they work together to manage caregiving responsibilities. Our results identify the need for additional individual and family level supports to build interpersonal skills and access counseling and other resources. One potential strategy for addressing these issues is to engage with social workers and family therapists for families. We heard from families quite clearly, all of the support is around the caregiver, around the care recipient. We need support ourselves. I'm trying to balance my children. I'm trying to balance my job. I'm trying to balance my relationship with my crazy family members. We all need help too. Our results also point to the need to prepare caregivers for situations and events they may face by providing examples of how problems were solved and identifying what issues could have made problems worse. Our results can inform the development of an educational workshop for caregivers on responding. So there are a number of things that we could have done differently with our study that we hope to do with future studies. But one thing that really stands out is, we need to hear from more men. Men are caregivers and they play essential roles oftentimes in the background. That perspective matters. And as I think about where we take this research in the future, really examining responding among caregiving networks and thinking about perhaps the development of a decision support tool. So with that, I want to thank you and acknowledge everyone who's been a part of this presentation, and be more than happy to discuss any questions.